Okay, I'm just gonna start quickly to do a few little housekeeping things, and then we'll get started in a sec. I want to introduce myself first. I'm Ami Bishop. I'm the Senior Research Advisor at Outright Action International, and I'm really happy to welcome you all to our 6th annual Out Summit, and in particular to this session um, on how we are going to go about ridding the world of what we call SOGIE change efforts. We're hoping that we will be able to reserve about 10 minutes of question and answer at the end. Please feel free as we go along to add questions into the chat, and we'll review those. We may pick some up along the way, and at the very least, we'll do our best to answer them at the end during the Q&A period. One other note, the session is being recorded, but only the panelists and moderators are visible on the screen. So hopefully that is then not an issue for anyone who doesn't wish to be visible. I do want to offer a trigger warning because this content, the content of this panel may be difficult for some. So please feel free at any point to exit the session, if you feel uncomfortable, and if you feel you need more additional support, we can arrange that for you as well. So I'm going to go ahead now and briefly introduce our fabulous panelists. Please go look at their full biographies on the Out Summit speakers tab. I've painfully shrunken their bios for the purpose of efficiency here, so I'm not quite doing them all justice. But I'm going to first start and just wave when I say your name with Desiree Attar, who's a lawyer, a legislative drafter, and human rights activist based in Malta. For the past 5 years, she's been leading the legal team within the Ministry for Equality, responsible for Malta's leap, as you wrote, into LGBTIQ plus rights, and has pushed forward important legal reforms, including the criminalization of conversion practices and the introduction of marriage equality. Welcome, Desiree. And we have Dr. Suhab Balut, who's an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and is the president of the Lebanese Medical Association for Sexual Health, also known as LEBMASH, which among other priorities has focused on campaigning against so-called conversion therapy in Lebanon. Then we have Nathan Despot. He's a survivor of 10 years of LGBTQA plus conversion practices. Since 2013, Nathan has been advocating for a nuanced and survivor-led response to conversion practices in Australia. In 2015, he co-founded the Brave Network, a conversion survivor support and advocacy group in Australia. So happy to have you, Nathan. Then we have Dr. Michael Ferguson, who's an instructor in neurology at Harvard Medical School. He was the named plaintiff in the Ferguson v. Jonah lawsuit, a first of its kind legal case that successfully shut down a conversion therapy provider on the basis of consumer fraud and unconscionable business practices. Dr. Ferguson is a co-founder as well of the organization called CT Survivors. And then Steve Litsicki is founder and executive director of Access Chapter 2. Currently, she serves also as the South African National AIDS Council co-chairperson, and she is the co-chair of the national task team established by the Department of Justice to address hate crimes and gender-based violence. Welcome, Steve. So I'm just going to spend literally a minute or so just to set a little bit of context, and I want to make a couple of points. First, about terminology. The practices that we're discussing are commonly referred to in English as conversion therapy to describe what we all know to be psychologically and physically harmful attempts to repress, change, cure diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. Although this is the language, I guess, that's most widely in circulation, most recognizable, we all know it's highly flawed. The word conversion implies that LGBTIQ people can be changed, which is neither true nor necessary. And these practices most certainly are not therapy, since being queer is not a pathology. So we prefer to use the term sexual orientation and gender identity or expression change efforts, SOGIE change efforts, or conversion practices, or if we're saying conversion therapy, we really usually say so-called conversion therapy. So in 2019, Outright Action International published the first ever research on the global reach of so-called conversion therapy, which was based on extensive literature review, a global survey representing 500 responses from about 80 countries, and 19 in-depth interviews with survivors from 11 countries. Our objectives were to characterize who's most vulnerable, what the main forms of SOGIE change efforts are, and who are the main promoters and perpetrators, and then most important, how these practices impact survivors. Our data suggested that SOGIE change efforts likely occur in nearly every corner of the world. And our survey and interview data reinforced existing evidence that these horrible practices never work and instead cause deep and lasting trauma. For those who are interested, if you want to see the report, you can download it from the Outright website, and also maybe, I don't know, Louisa or Cecilia, who is assisting this session, could post it in the chat. I forgot to pull that up. But the focus of this panel actually is really to discuss existing and potential pathways and conditions necessary for eradicating these harmful practices. Just 5 countries in the world ban so-called conversion therapy. They're Brazil, Ecuador, Germany, Malta, and Taiwan, while other countries such as Australia, Canada, and the US have sort of state or provincial level laws, subnational laws, and all vary in substance in some way. Legislative bans, of course, while incredibly important, can also miss the mark, though, if they're not survivor informed and comprehensive enough to cover formal and informal practitioners, religious personnel, and adults, as well as minors, for example. So the other point is where sodomy and other criminalization laws still stand. It's clearly an uphill battle to address these practices. In any case, as awareness grows, as there's more data about what's happening in the world and the harm that they cause, we really want to now be not now, because many of you have been doing this for a long time. We want to learn from those who have been doing the work to look at best practices and pathways for curtailing or eradicating so-called conversion therapy in a variety of contexts. So this is really the focus of our session. So with that, I would like to turn first to Desiree. Desiree, Malta is just one of 5 countries in the world with a national ban on so-called conversion therapies. So could you tell us a little bit about how this issue became prioritized, what the key provisions are, and perhaps most important, what sort of impact has it had on LGBTIQ plus people in Malta?
Sure. Thanks, Amy. And let me start by saying, first of all, that this is my first Out Summit, and it's truly overwhelming. I mean, coming from a tiny island like Malta to see such a beautiful and diverse international community come together like this, it's truly beautiful to see. So anyway, yeah, back to Malta. Just to give a little context, since 2014, we've managed to completely, give more visibility to the LGBTIQ community in Malta. In the 2000s, Pride events would consist of, I don't know, 5 to 10 people in our capital, and they'd probably get rocks thrown at them. So that was the context where we started from. Since 2014, we managed to entrench sexual orientation and gender identity as characteristics which are protected from all forms of discrimination in our constitution. We managed to affirm the right to live by one's lived gender without the need for any medical or surgical operations. So it's just a legal change. We've managed to introduce civil unions for all and later marriage equality for all. So, of course, the criminalization of change efforts was just a natural step in this entire process. So it felt natural to legislate to this effect as well. It was just one link in the chain which was needed and is still needed. Of course, our laws are advanced, yes, but they are far from perfect. I mean, just in 2018, we managed to ensure that IVF leave would be accessible to all, irrespective of civil status or sexual orientation or relationships. So we're still far from perfect. We're, of course, complementing the law with policy. We are striving to ensure that our schools are equipped with syllabi which are as inclusive as possible. We need to ensure that our professionals, I don't know, even government customer care or officials are trained to treat people with the respect they deserve. We need to ensure that our support services are as strong as we would like them to be. So there is much which remains to be done, but we are proud of the fact that we do criminalize these change efforts, because as you said, they are not conversion practices. So while the law does refer to them as conversion practices, we know that they are anything but practice or theory. So we have tried to make sure that the law is as far-reaching as possible. We have also, by means of the Criminalization of Conversion Practices Act, depathologized sexual orientation and gender identity. We felt that this was also a very, very important step. Yes, but so we made sure that no one, including any medical professional, can not only provide but also solicit and advertise these kind of services. We have provided that any such services, I don't know, I don't like calling them services, but I'm using this term, would bring about a higher penalty if they are offered to vulnerable people. And by vulnerable persons, I'm not only referring to minors, but any persons with disability or without the ability to consent, which in Maltese law is very wide. Consent, the possibility to give consent is not only related to age or ability, but also the frame of mind. So the courts would have to take into consideration the state of mind of the person at that point in time, whether they were under some or whether they were being forced into it by their family members or by their community. So yes, it is quite wide. My only issue, I'll be very, very quick. It has been the biggest impact, I believe, has been the fact that it is a very big symbol for the community in Malta. The government has clearly said, listen, this is unacceptable. This is definitely not a healthcare service or a religious service. This is nothing but an attempt to dehumanize you. So that has been the biggest effect of this law. And I'll stop here. We'll speak later.
We definitely will. Thank you. Thank you for that. There are a number of points that you raised that I'd love to come back to. But for the moment, we'll go to Nathan, for whom it's 2 a.m. So we should all particularly appreciate his participation right now. But Nathan, because of your political system in Australia, you're taking a different approach. You're pursuing legislation at the state level. And while several states, Queensland, Australian Capital Territory, have recently passed laws against SOGIE change efforts, you are on the brink of passing perhaps some of the most comprehensive legislation in the world in Victoria. So in particular, can you share with us how the survivor movement was able to take an important leadership role in crafting this very nuanced and comprehensive legislation, and also maybe say just a few words about what that legislation says?
So Brave Network started about 5 years ago, an advocacy group for survivors. We have members across Australia as well, particularly during the COVID lockdown. We sort of grew to become Brave Network Australia. Originally, we were really interested in just making sure that survivors were okay. There was just an avalanche of survivors coming out of the woodwork who were really seeking support, particularly from large evangelical communities. and also a small number of Catholics and people from Eastern Orthodox churches. We also had interest from media, and we felt that media was really fetishizing survivors, usually finding isolated survivors and sharing their stories without making sure they had mental health support, and usually talking about instances of conversion practices from 20 or 30 years ago that are not so common in Australia anymore. You know, emphasizing torture and electroshock therapy, which, while you know those things happen in other countries, they're not happening in Australia anymore. We also found that media was not using the right language, and they would use terms like gay conversion therapy, which excluded all the bi and trans and other folks and lesbians that were part of Brave. Yeah, and so we, I guess, began to have our voice heard when we saw that there was, I guess, space to educate journalists. So we started not just training survivors on how to share their stories with media, but also training media on how to handle the stories of survivors and how to do that ethically. So we created ethical guidelines a bit later on when we created the SOGIE survivor statement as part of SOGIE survivors. And then I guess we also noticed that many of the survivors at Brave really struggled to thrive in terms of education and employment. And there were, you know, there was poor mental health and higher rates of homelessness and the risk of homelessness. We also found that surveys being done on people who had experienced conversion practices were poorly worded and weren't really capturing the right information. And that, you know, we wanted to see people in the LGBTIQA+ community asked questions like, has anyone ever told you that you're broken? Has anyone tried to indicate that you are disordered? Has anyone tried to make a link between childhood trauma and you being queer? You know, has someone tried to do something about that? Has someone prayed with you consistently? Have you gone through prayer ministry or pastoral care for that? And we found that that usually turned up a lot of people saying, oh yes, like I've been through that, I can relate to that question, even if those people had not been able to relate to the question, have you been through gay conversion therapy? So as time went on, we also realized most survivors had a very strong faith, and a lot of the allies who are part of Brave and come to our monthly meetings are theologians or former megachurch leaders who are very respected. And Victoria is quite unique in this regard because, you know, in Sydney, it has, you know, the city of Sydney has some very conservative evangelical movements that we don't have in Melbourne. We started holding regular dinners for evangelical and Christian leaders, secret dinners, where the latest one we had 40 evangelical pastors from fairly significant churches come together to meet with survivors in a safe environment, which we found to be really helpful. And I guess also in the last few years, we started meeting with representatives of our state government to help frame what a future inquiry or public consultation might look like. And we're just so pleased that so many of our definitions and recommendations were taken on, even, you know, our definitions and language as well. So we wanted to make sure that the language we used was weighted against risk and the level of harm, the prevalence and the context of conversion practices, which is why we scrapped the word therapy as well, because we found that that really didn't describe what most people had been through. And we also wanted to make sure in our advocacy, in our language, that we separated out conversion ideology from conservative theology. So to point out that, you know, yes, it is very harmful for people to be called sinners and to be told they're going to hell. And that can certainly be a basis of some of the harmful conversion practices. But this idea of brokenness and being disordered is not necessarily a deep part of Christian theology and belief or the belief systems of other religions. And I guess we're really pleased I'm pleased to say that pretty much all of our recommendations have found their way into the Victorian Change and Suppression Practices Prohibition Bill, which passed the lower house of our parliament yesterday and will go for debate in the upper house in February. And this bill will essentially criminalise if psychological injury can be proven, which is actually not as high a bar as it sounds. It will criminalise every conversion practice performed by anyone to anyone, regardless of age, payment, or whether it's a professional person. and it acknowledges the role of therapeutic fraud, as well as advertising, inducement, referrals, and also the role of negligence and malpractice there as well, if it's the failure to refer, for example, a psychologist when they're working with a trans person as well. So we're pretty proud of this bill.
As you should be. Thank you,
Thank
Nathan.
you.
Congratulations on the milestone you reached yesterday. Let me now turn to Michael, because Michael was part of a really landmark case here in the US on this topic. Strategic litigation is another approach to curtailing these harmful practices, and your case was particularly important because it got to the issue of promotion of SOGIE change efforts by religious organizations, which Nathan just touched on as well. Can you tell us briefly about your lawsuit and what the impact has been, and also how your case might inform the way forward for survivors in other countries?
Absolutely, thank you. And I do want to start by just acknowledging the hard work of you, Ami, as well as Outright Action International in organizing this summit. This is so crucial and it's so life-giving to us as survivor advocates, so thank you very much. I do want to focus my comments on two principles, and I want to talk about love and justice. Because love and justice are two interdependent principles, and I want us to take a moment for a brief recollection. And I invite you to recall a time when you felt loved. All of us here have been loved, otherwise we wouldn't be here today. Softly remember this feeling of love, and in this mental space, let's breathe into what that essence really is. Love and justice. We have to stay grounded and connected to these principles. It's absolutely vital for this work. When I was in medical school and living in New York City, I was at church one Sunday in Union Square, and I noticed someone visiting for the first time. I wanted to make them feel welcome and comfortable, so I introduced myself to them, and that was a very fateful introduction. Their name was Sam Wolf, and Sam, it turns out, was a person very much in the flow of love and justice. In fact, Sam would eventually become an attorney at the Southern Poverty Law Center, advocating for gender and sexual minorities. Organically, as Sam and I developed a friendship and he learned about my experiences in conversion therapy, Sam eventually asked me if I had ever considered filing a lawsuit against my former conversion therapy provider in Jersey City. I had not. There are so many turns in this story that I cannot cover in 5 minutes, but suffice for now to say that when I met the man who would eventually become my husband, he told me that he would support me in pursuing justice. That was the union of love and justice that I needed to move ahead. That unity of love and justice came in waves that successively granted me greater amounts of courage. At first, I was going to be an anonymous John Doe plaintiff in the case. Then, as love and justice worked their mysteries on me, I agreed to use my real name in the complaint. And finally, I agreed to be the named plaintiff in the case that became known as Ferguson v. Jonah. Two main aspects of the legal theory in Ferguson v. Jonah are that conversion therapy represents fraud and that it uses unconscionable business practices. Of note, the Ferguson v. Jonah case is the first LGBTQ rights case in the United States legal history decided by a jury and not by a judge. This is a really crucial point for a number of reasons. One, it means that when everyday people learn details about conversion therapy, they recognize it exactly for what it is: fraud that is shocking to the conscience. Secondly, it means that within the framework of existing laws, we can right now proactively seek justice for the harms and abuses perpetrated against gender and sexual minorities by conversion therapy. And for the activists in the back row, let me say that one more time. It means that within the framework of existing laws right now, we can seek justice for the harms that are perpetrated against our sexual and gender minority communities. Because time is limited today, I want to close my comments with 3 brief highlight points. 1, the fantastic work that is being done to make it easier and more forthcomingly possible for CT survivors to pursue justice. And I love the work that Nathan Despot and his colleagues are doing in Australia with the therapeutic refraud paradigm. There is also an article in the 2015 Northwestern University Law Review by Peter Dabrowski that lays out a state-by-state strategy for conversion therapy cessation in the United States, also based on the fraud theory. Secondly, I have to give a shout out and praise my incredible co-plaintiffs in the Jonah trial. Justice takes a village. This is a team effort. Chaim Levin, Benji Unger, Sheldon Bruck, we are brothers for life. 3, healing is also a team effort. Matt Ashcroft and Rocky Tishma, we are locked in. We're the co-founders of an organization called CT Survivors. I would invite you to check out ctsurvivors.org and see if you may feel some kind of a sense of community in the healing work that we're doing there. Love and justice. That's what we're about, fam. We got this.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Michael. That was, it's amazing to hear you talk about this. And yes, love and justice is at the root of everything. But it almost feels like, okay, we're done with the panel, but we're not. I want to turn now to Suha Balut. So among a number of priorities that LebMash focuses on, one is to eradicate SOGIE change efforts. And you've worked both with national professional psychiatric and psychological associations, as well as the media, to raise awareness about how being queer is not a disease. And I think you were actually censored for some of that work. But I wonder if you can give us an overview of the situation in Lebanon and describe your efforts, how you chose these strategies, what have been the challenges and also the impact of the work that you've been doing.
Thank you, Ami. And it's a pleasure to be talking to people all over the world and share some of our successful strategies. And it's hard to follow Nathan with justice and love because I will have conversations around that, but there will also be some not so much positive experiences in Lebanon with the overall situation. So a little bit about like Lebanon. Lebanon is a very small country. It's like Malta. You know, sometimes small countries are easy to advance some of this work, and other times it's harder because it feels like everybody could know everyone. And, you know, Lebanon being in the Middle East has its rich history that's shaped by the cultural identity, and especially, you know, religious and ethnic diversity is something that we value. And our system is, you know, legal system is like parliamentary democracy that includes confessionalism, which is like, you know, in the high ranking offices in the government, they're reserved for members of specific religious groups. And when we talk about like, you know, the officially recognized religious groups, we have 18 of them. And, you know, each of these religious groups have their own family law and legislation and set of religious courts. So when we're going up through the legal system and trying to legalize things at a national level, we've got a battle to go forward with. The legal system in Lebanon is based on the French system because we were a French mandate, and our civil law is an exception for matters related to personal status, which are governed by like the separate set of laws designed for each sectarian community. And so when it comes to LGBT rights, the system, we could say, is like quasi-LGBT friendly because we have long fought to end the use of Article 534 of the Penal Code to prosecute consensual same-sex conduct. The law is one of the residual colonial relics that we still have that are put in place by the French mandate in the early 1900s, and it punishes, quote unquote, any sexual intercourse contrary to the order of like nature, whatever, however that is designed or explained. And so, you know, people could be punished up to 1 year in prison. And so this law at times has been used to threaten or prosecute LGBT people in the country. And it's been more affecting vulnerable groups and some Syrian refugees as well. And so over the years, especially in the last like 5 to 10 years, once we started talking about, banning these efforts, a lot of the courts came out, like the district court came out in July 2018, kind of appealing the law and saying consensual sex between people of the same sex is not unlawful. And so there are several rulings as well by similar judges from the lower courts. And so encouragingly last year, when we had our recent parliamentary election, several prominent candidates publicly advocated to repeal Article 534. Like that's for the first time being discussed openly. However, once the new government was established, we were facing current events. Like if we want to talk about current events in Lebanon, like in October 2019, we started witnessing an uprising and people were, advocating against the current political regime. They wanted to change, they wanted to end corruption and advocate human rights violations, including, repealing Article 534. And with that, we can actually advance our work and put policies against sexual orientation, gender identity change efforts. However, this uprising was faced by economic turmoil that led to an economic crash and contributed to like the Lebanese pound losing more than 80% of its worth. And so there was a subsequent banking crisis. And then in February 21, this year, we had the first COVID case on top of what was happening. And so then since then, there were many, many other cases, lockdowns. And so the government has been frozen focusing on these efforts. And then on August 4th, there was an explosion at the Beirut airport. And it's the Lebanon's main airport destroyed its surrounding areas, killing more than 200 people, thousands were injured. And now we have 300,000 people displaced in Lebanon. And so this also area is significant because it was close to the area where a lot of the LGBTQ community felt safe. It's a region in Beirut where many LGBT people lived. And so we've been facing a lot of efforts. So what LebMash has done since like 2017, 2018, by trying to work with local psychiatric and psychological associations and medical associations to put a plan to have a whole campaign against like homosexuality is not a disease. And we put a hotline to report these efforts. We did a national study to understand what was going on. And we have a protocol to talk to providers who are reported to be practicing these efforts on how we cannot report them. We cannot sue them. We cannot use all these systems. We cannot threaten by, revoking their medical licensure because on the books, we don't have any legal efforts that would support that. We've been successful to save many lives to try to get them to use our LEB guide, which is a guide of LGBT-friendly providers, and help people, go through affirmative practices and, to empower them. We have resources to help them live safely and not rely on people who are actually harming them. And we've been very successful. However, our work is, we're part of an NGO, project-based. Funding sometimes is hard. And at the same time, we are faced by some national efforts where safety is a priority. Now our efforts are targeted towards providing housing and immediate needed healthcare. And so we've always had interruptions, but we've made advances.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, when you think about what Lebanon has had to deal with in the last year, even, it is overwhelming. Let me now turn to Steve, who's been patiently waiting. Steve, as such a long time and really deeply respected activist and human rights defender in South Africa, it's a broader question to you. How have you and your colleagues approached this issue? What sort of, I don't know, strategic groundwork is needed to bring attention to the issue? And what would you say are the key steps towards eradicating these harmful practices?
Yeah, thank you, and really good evening to colleagues, to friends of Out Summit, and I mean it's also quite interesting to have the Out Summit in this fashion, but you know technology brings us together, so I'm quite appreciative of that effort. I think first to really recognize the fact that you know our partnership on this project, which is supported by you know Outright International through the Netherlands support. We work with in Africa there's 3-country focus: South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. And here in South Africa, I think what is key to note is that you know, conversion therapy is not recognized formally as a practice in South Africa, and of course, the correct or most used terms that you find, you know, are reparative therapy, and there are no specific laws regulating or dealing with any facts or acts which can be characterized as reparative therapy. And also, what is also key is that there's been limited research which captures the local activities characterizing conversion practice itself. And we've seen from different sectors, because for us, we took up this project, learning, understanding, you know, these practices that have been going on, but silently so, and which we have not defined or characterized them in a way that is defined as conversion therapy. And we've seen this within different sectors. So it's not only the medical space where psychologists or psychiatrists are playing a role, it's also the religious component and the traditional component. And I think what we have done was to try localize you know, the conversion practice, redefine it in the way that we will understand. When we started this work over a year ago, we looked at, you know, the desktop, whether is there a little bit of evidence that we can work with, and there was, because we also gave the practice a face. Our communities, our stakeholders understand when you bring different types of evidence or voices to actually amplify what we mean by the conversion practices that must end in South Africa. But I think also there are blocks that needs to be unpacked, and these blocks have to do with, you know, the behavioral interventions from religion, sexual assault. You would have known in South Africa we've been having quite extensive high rate of hate crimes, particularly corrective rape for that matter. And the word, you must hear it, corrective, curative. And that's a form of practice that, as we are conversing and talking about the harassments and abuses that we've been seeing, corrective rape has been one of the long-standing practices that we've been seeing. But some of the traditional and cultural intervention that also speaks to the family interventions. And you know, by virtue of not having a law that has banned conversion practices, it makes it even impossible to regulate parents' activities, families' activities that conceptualize their practices of conversion in this case, because there are current debates that are taking place, of course. And I think when we started working with traditional leaders, I can tell you, traditional leaders, the House of Traditional Leaders in Parliament actually opened up the space to work with Acts Chapter 2. And we were very careful on how we want to attend to this. We just don't public row. We want to actually then say, how do we turn this into a way that changes a long term, not dealing with case by case, but rather than deal with the system itself, because it's a system of heteronormativity, it's a system of patriarchy, it's a system of many inequalities that we've seen which are intersectional. The other issue is that there's been a lot of pushback, whether you're looking at comprehensive sexuality education, whether you're looking at what is happening with sexual reproductive health and rights. These are contested issues in Africa, in South Africa, which we are still debating today. That also makes it even easier to see conversion practice at play. Now, what is the name of the campaign that we've had? We've called it Inqeba Lam, it's actually a word that defines a wound. my wound. And we wanted to do it in two forms, because when you tell stories of LGBTI people, we did not want to look at only the harmful aspect of it. It's what has LGBTI people have lived through over the years, things that have followed them to adulthood. So it's looking at the extreme of wound, the extreme of harm that has actually followed LGBTI people to adulthood. I can tell you myself, because I, in my teenagehood, have been prayed to. There were sessions that were organized by my family where I was prayed for on a daily basis, because they needed to cast out the whole evilness out of me. And when we got to the stories and gave it faces, that's where you actually get to know exactly what is happening. So a lot of LGBTI people don't know what conversion practice or conversion therapy word is, but when you talk about the practice and what constitute conversion practice, people will tell you stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting on such an important point. As I mean, that's some of what we also found, is that in fact the terminology is not known in so many places, but when you actually describe what it is that people are subjected to, it's like, oh yes, that happened to me. I want to just pick up on a couple of points. You've all raised the importance of um, doing the groundwork with whether it's practitioners or whether it's religious leaders. I want to, for many countries around the world, this topic has not ever really been part of an advocacy agenda. And you know, because as you're saying, Steve, there's so many intersectionalities and so many issues that are wrapped up, that it's part of an overall kind of regressive conservative agenda, that it's not necessarily even wise to tease it out fully. But I'm just wanting to ask each of you, you know, looking ahead to for activists, for survivors around the world who want to start engaging in advocacy on this, what kinds of recommendations might you have based on your own experiences? Let me start. Maybe Nathan, do you want to start with that? And just a couple of minutes each, because I want to make sure we have enough time for some Q&A.
Sure, yeah. I just want to shout out to my good friend Chris Chabbs, who's also watching this session now. And Chris and myself and a range of other survivors put together the SOGIE survivor statement, which I can put a link up to in a moment. And that was us really teasing out, it's like a fairly lengthy document with recommendations of what exactly is the ideology, what are the core assertions, and we actually spelt out what are the false and misleading claims. What are the, so we've got like a section on the religious assertions, which makes sense to religious leaders, which we can talk over and use as the basis of our conversation. You know, are these assertions things that you believe? Do you see these things as being core tenets of your faith? And then you've got the false and misleading claims, which have been really helpful in our discussion of relating to, you know, practice standards and the code of ethics of professional health bodies. I think that it's really important to spend time articulating the ideology, the beliefs, you know, what are those false claims? I know that you said before, it's not always easy, not always helpful to tease out what is part of really a, you know, a regressive agenda of the right. But actually we found it really helpful and therapeutic to sort of put it all out there in a formulated sort of way. And I might just quickly add as well that one of the things that I found really important about the Ferguson versus Jonah case is the pre-trial ruling, where essentially the court had to say, before we can rule that this is consumer fraud, we first need the pre-trial declaration that, by the way, queer people are not broken or disordered. And there was a range of witnesses that sort of declared that. In Australia or in Victoria, we didn't need guidance from our peak regulating body. But I think it's really important as well to do an audit of what are the current standards and codes in a jurisdiction. And I was thinking of what Suha was saying about Lebanon, for example, and I think that, you know, in Australia we have this very clear code of ethics, and it's got, you know, two things. One, you need to make sure that a client or patient has got enough information to provide informed consent, you know. And if you don't explain to them that the practice you're going to take them through has led 97% of participants to experience harm or extreme harm, then you're not really providing them with enough information. And secondly, if there's an alternative affirmative or competent professional down the road that you could refer them to and you fail to refer them, that's also malpractice, right? So I think it's about working out what's the groundwork, but I also think survivors should take time to actually write a little manifesto like we did of what is all this rubbish that we ingested going through conversion practices, and spend time with it and spend time talking about it with religious leaders. And yeah.
Great. No, thank you. I think that's really very instructive. Let me turn, Desiree, what about you from your perspective? Since you also sort of started from almost, I don't want to say nothing, but you know, you really started from scratch on this effort.
We did, yes. And I would say that activists need to reach out not only to politicians or aspiring politicians, because in our case, it was a new government which hadn't been in power for over 20 years. So what activists did was they reached out to aspiring members of parliament and the aspiring prime minister and clearly laid out the terms for their support. We want marriage equality, we want the legal recognition of our lived gender, so on and so forth. So I do believe that political will is crucial and activists also need to pursue that. I also think we need to go on a more grassroots level. We usually think that the rest of the world is against us or they do not understand. It is really usually not the case. Coming from a country which is, at least statistically speaking, mostly Catholic, you would think that we would have faced plenty of opposition on the streets to the changes that we have made to our law and policy. It was not the case, because once you sit down with these people and they realize that in any family you could have a son, a daughter who's LGBTIQ, who could have been forced by, I don't know, the community, the parish priest to undergo these change efforts. People realize this is about humanity, this is about communities coming together and protecting their own. So I think we really need to think outside the box sometimes and go and, you know, spread our message to places where we usually would not go.
Thank you. Thank you. Michael, let me turn to you because you described a bit of a journey to get taking up your case, but do you also have some thoughts or advice for activists and survivors in other places?
I do, yeah. So
starting this
number one. Hello now. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. So
yep.
There are two things that initially come to mind. One is, so as a neuroscientist, I am studying what in our brain drives human beings to be religious. And spoiler alert, it is very, very, very deep in our nervous system. So the degree to which we are framing this as religion versus gender identity and sexual orientation, like, that's just, we're setting ourselves up for a disaster, and we're setting ourselves up to elicit such profound biological defense mechanisms that we don't need to provoke. I could go on about this. So suffice for now to say, I think it's crucial that this is not something that we frame as like, oh, it's now we're out to sack religion. Actually, and this leads into my second point, I have been so beautifully surprised at unexpected alliances from people in traditionally conservative religious spaces. You know, there really, really is something about interpersonal connection. Making friendships with people who you would just assume are going to be your political enemies is this glorious and hope-giving experience You know, and I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it and think like, oh, well, we can just walk into any place and everybody's going to be our friend. No, of course I'm not saying that. But I am saying that from my experience, there are spaces where I have found unexpected allies. And that is another piece that I would offer here, is to create the possibility that those who we might immediately assume are going to be in an oppositional stance against us could actually be sympathetic as we mutually humanize.
Thank you. Thank you. That point, let me turn to Steve actually, and then Suha, I'll come to you after. But Steve, this sort of finding allies in unexpected places, has that been your experience in this work in South Africa yet? And same question as well, as sort of advice going forward for activists and survivors.
Yeah, look, I think for us it was quite crucial because, you know, we can't do a kind of policy change and ignore the realities. And really, I agree with colleagues, you know, in terms of exploring, engaging stakeholders, you know, who have never necessarily aligned to your agenda. And that's what we have done. The reality of, you know, for us to engage the House of Traditional Leaders, engaging the religious leaders, engaging also the Psychology Association, was merely to have this conversation and bring about collective solutions to really the question at hand. And I'll tell you why it was necessary for us. We have quite a lot of anecdotal data and even the research that we are embarking on now that actually is presenting evidence of what is taking place. But these things are known. Now we are giving it a name, we are giving it evidence or a face, but doing so you need to allow traditional, or you need to allow stakeholders to really look at whether they can champion this conversation. This is a behavioral change communication approach we wanted to apply because it cannot be our struggle alone. We need allies at the grassroots level. We need LGBTI people, we need allies in civil society, because as we have highlighted, these are intersectional realities. You know, for us, if the end goal that we are looking at, which is around banning the activities or practices that are viewed at trying to convert, you know, individuals on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity and expression, this will allow us to really deal with the, you know, toxic spaces that often have been pushing us back, that are not conducive for many LGBTI people and respecting of dignity and self-determination. So for us, we realized that we needed to expand beyond the usual allies that we have. We needed to tap on that. And I can tell you that there has been a welcoming idea to sit down. For the first time, the House of Traditional Leaders actually invited us into the assembly. Wow. To actually have this conversation around LGBTI.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Suha, let me turn to you. I'm monitoring the time. I want to, if there are any questions that are coming, please put them in. We'll have a few minutes left, but Suha, please let me ask you the same question.
Well, we have found friends in unexpected places. However, understanding the environment in Lebanon, where religious leaders are not only religious leaders, they do have political and economic powers. They also have an agenda that is beyond only religion, and if I may say that. And so it has been hard to get any religious leaders to acknowledge, you know, the conversations out in the open. And also we have had a lot of backlash from religious leaders, and they were behind being banned to talk about some of our SOGIE effort, change effort project. And what we decided at LabMash is that there's another route, and to use our healthcare identity, since we are an organization of healthcare professionals. And so we have we did have to look at what works for us, and we have the backing of our medical associations, especially the psychological and psychiatric medical associations in Lebanon, and societies and healthcare professionals, because a lot of times that's where, you know, some of these efforts happen. We've also targeted school nurses. Some school nurses had to have, like, we did some workshops and educational roundtables with school nurses to try to educate them about, you know, identifying some of these harmful practices at home. We were not able to, you know, talk to parents or, you know, try to challenge the patriarchal heteronormative ideologies among parents, but we hope that, you know, our national campaigns are targeting those efforts and, you know, those ideologies. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from youth who are saying that, you know, some of these conversations are changing at home because of some of what we've been doing. And we've also put out there where anonymously people can go to our LabGuide, our guide for affirmative healthcare providers. And so parents with their youth can go and can get educated about the harmful practices of what has been happening at home. We all know, like, parents love their kids, and some of these efforts that start at home are not because the parents don't like their kids, they're just afraid of what the future could look like for their kids.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we won't have time and haven't been able to really get into the issue of addressing the needs of kids, of minors, and family, sort of family partnership in perpetuating and perpetrating these practices. But that's certainly a huge issue. Let me just go do a quick round robin, like 15, 20 seconds each. If there are any other final thoughts you want to offer the audience, anything that you wanted to say that didn't have a chance, and then we'll wrap up. Who would like to start? Go ahead, anybody. All right, Michael, you start.
My thought is that what we're doing right now is exactly what needs to happen. We have to go international. We have to learn from what's going on in our global community, and we have to transcend the creeping nationalistic tendencies. And I see the gender and sexual minority global population as such a beautiful antidote to a lot of the siloing that's happening around the world.
Thank you. Nathan, you want to go next?
Yeah, I guess just to say that our perspective is that from the legislation point of view, that it either has to cover all conversion practices, which means our bill in Victoria has gone into religious places, and it's listed prayer-based practices in it. But that's because underneath that is a strong understanding that this bill is not about God, but this is a bill grounded in faith positive perspectives. And what Michael said before about love and justice, like, that is basically what this is about. I don't think any legislative or regulatory interventions into conversion practices should be combative. I think they should be about learning and education and reconciliation, and affirmation. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. All right, quick other, Desiree, any last
I'd just like to say that even when we do make progress, there will always be reactionary forces against us. We just have to keep pushing forward, keep pushing, keep working for what we believe in, because ultimately, and that is what has to drive you, you are on the right side of history, you are morally right, you are socially and ethically right, you are being humane and caring, and, you know, just as Michael said, this is about love and justice. So, you know, just keep pushing, and thank you all so much for this.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Suha?
I just would, you know, follow up and say similar words and saying, you know, this is a journey and we will always have accomplishments and we will find new challenges, and we'll keep moving forward, because at the end, like Michael said, love should prevail and justice is important for all. So we'll keep working.
Thank you. Thank you. Steve, you have the last word.
Yeah, no, thank you. Look, I think there is something for me that is key for, the participants, delegates of Out Summit, but also for the world, that, lives are at stake. That's the reality. So if we're going to act, we have to act swiftly. We need to fast track efforts that support activists doing this work, so that we can fight to put urgent measures, to hold states accountable, that pushes back around practices of conversion. I think its priority is the protection of children and young people, because we know the situations in schools, the situations at home. People are locked up with families that are homophobic. There is forced marriages. There is quite a lot of activities that are taking place. But I think what is key, supporting local activists to lead community-led, that understand the dynamics, that understand some of the cultural and traditional activities that are taking place. Now, the last one I want to say, the religious groups, unfortunately, are organized, they are well-funded, and they're coming out strong in Africa, in South Africa. And for us, we have been seeing so much of investment that goes against pushing back the comprehensive sexuality education, pushing back on LGBTI or the use of sexual orientation and gender identity. And these are dynamics that we are dealing with on a daily basis. So we do need that support.
Yeah. I want to thank you all so much. We need to wrap up and let people move to the next, the keynote address by Hamed Sino from Lebanon, actually.